In this chapter of Message Crawler Video Manual, we're going to look at how we convert DAT file to RSMF. Let's jump to PowerPoint first. We'll talk theory and then we'll do a demo. All right, we're going to convert an industry standard DAT file, and I will tell you right away the conversion of these DAT files is one of the more difficult processes in Message Crawler. The reason for that is DAT files comes in all shapes and sizes. They have different delimiters, they have different fields, and those fields could be formatted differently. So because of that, you should be familiar with fields that are required for RSMF and make sure you have all the appropriate fields and they're formatted correctly. Message Crawler will help you with some of these steps, but you should be aware of what data you are putting in. So let's talk about what are the DAT file requirements for Message Crawler. So we want it to be Concordance DAT file, meaning we use Concordance delimiters, and we have attachments followed on the next row after the message itself. We don't want to have attachments going across like some forensic software exports. We want them to be in our normal format that we're all used to. There should be an identifier for families, like a group identifier, which helps keep families together. Now, some other fields required. So we want to have DocID because we want everything numbered. We want to have a group identifier. We want to have a record type, email, or attachment. That's always nice to have. Field from is going to say who sent the message. And then we can have a field to or participants. To field is if you have a couple of people sending messages to each other, or you can have participants if people were in a group environment, they were in a group chat of some sort, so we'll have all other people who were also seeing this message. We need to have our date and time, of course, because we need to know what time it was done, and the text of the message. Text of the message could be the actual text, or it could be path to it. Both options are supported. And for attachments, we want to know path to the attachment and name of the attachment so we can pull them in and embed them into RSMF file. Now, what will not work, which I briefly mentioned, attachments on the same line as the message. So you have your message and attachment 1, attachment 2, attachment 3, 4, and so on. It needs to be the next line below the message. Text messages with headers. Some software tries to recreate text messages as emails, so they would put from, date, and then the actual line of the message that was said. That is not going to work. I mean, technically it will load, but your RSMF file will look kind of funny because we already have all those extra metadata. And I would discourage using non-concordance delimiters because you may have errors. If you're using like good pipe and carrot, maybe, but CSV, pretty sure it's going to be a problem. All right. If you do need to change your delimiters, there is a section where you can adjust your delimiters, as well as encoding. If you're using unusual encoding, or if you load data and it looks weird, you can change your encoding and reload your DAT file. And to get started, you are going to click on Import DAT File button. And once you do, you will be presented with a grid view of your DAT file. And now you can scroll around, you can look at it, you can see what you have. And subsequently, you will need to map your fields from a DAT file to RSMF fields. Message Crawler usually does a good job at automatically figuring out what needs to be mapped to what, so you don't have to click on the fields each time. Now on the screen here, we see that importance field is not mapped to anything because this was not supplied in this DAT file, which is okay. And also conversation identifier hasn't been mapped because there is no good field to use to group conversations together. Now, what's a conversation identifier? Well, this is something that will determine how many messages go into one RSMF file. So anytime that field changes, a new RSMF file will start. And this is something you will have to make decision based on your data. If you have a longer conversations, they'll be easier to review because reviewers can just scroll through them. But when it comes time for productions, well, you'll have to redact more messages before producing. And then the other way around, if you make shorter conversations, then the reviewers have to go to document more often, but productions will be easier. Creating conversation threads. So this is what we want to do. Message Crawler will help you create them, and some applications will do that for you as well. Oxygen Forensics Relativity Export does create thread ID, So you can use that. If you don't like the way it's created, you can create your own. ESI Analyst, it creates multiple threads, so you can thread your documents in every which way you want. And if you don't like any of those, you can use Message Crawler to adjust that again. You can use room IDs like Slack rooms or maybe conversation IDs from Google Hangout. In my experience, they create too long of email chains or message chains. Unless you have a room which is very dormant and people pop in once in a while, then it would be okay to put that all into one RSMF file. But if it's a fairly active group, you will have too many messages per group. So the way you can create your own conversations is by that group room ID and a date. So each day per room, you will get a new RSMF file. And in my experience, that's usually been a good way to chop up your conversations. The other way you can create conversations is by analyzing names. So we can look at from and to names as well as participant names and find unique combination of messages where people are messaging each other. And then we can use that to remove duplicates, sort names in the order, and then create a hash value that's going to be our conversation for that group of communications. So that's very helpful when you get a lot of like random text messages from different forensic software and you don't really know what goes with what. And analyzing those names will really help you organize your data well. All right. So in this screenshot, we have Message Crawler set up to use a timestamp to group documents by a day. If you look at the bottom, you see that there's a timestamp that's been selected for conversation identifier and a format mask has been applied. Year, month, day, which means timestamp will be formatted to date format. Only year, month, and day will be selected, and that's how conversations are going to be split up. The other way to do it is if you don't want to trust the application to do it at runtime, you can use a date format tool. The date format tool will take your timestamp and it will copy it to a new field. It'll apply the formatting you want, and it will also take your date and push it down to all the attachments. So you get sort of something like a sort date. And with that, you can preview your results and you can see, do I like this? Do I not like this? Do I want to try again? And if you like it, then you can map your new formatted date as a conversation identifier. And then we get into export options. You can enter name of the export platform like Slack, Bloomberg, and so on. And you should choose correct type of conversation, which will help with visualizing data in Relativity, whether this is a channel communication or is it direct people to person. Export format is going to be important because we want to know what are we exporting this to. Message Crawler does support additional file formats besides RSMF, which is EML, HTML, and if you want to poke around and see what's going on behind the scenes, you can export a JSON file. And a names delimiter is extremely important. Different software export with different delimiters. Usually it's either comma or semicolon, and you do want to specify correct name delimiter. Otherwise, if you have last name comma first and you specify comma as a delimiter, you are going to have bad names. All right, it's time for demo. Let's take that file, process it through Message Crawler, put it into Relativity, and see what it looks like. I'm going to open Message Crawler and I'm going to click on Import DAT. Now, like we talked about before, if you do need to modify your encoding or delimiters, you should do it before you open a DAT file, but we're going to be okay with the DAT file I'm using. So I'm going to navigate to my DAT file and I have my attachments in these folders. So that's going to be okay. So I'll click on Open and now the DAT file will be loaded to the grid. So let's go over different fields that we need to map in order for Message Crawler to work. First, we have an ID, and this is just a sequential number. If you have same ID from one DAT file to another, it's okay. It's not super critical. However, it's nice to have a unique ID, and everything we do in lit support, we want to have some kind of sequential unique number. This is what it is. Next is we have a group ID. A group ID is like a bag attach field or group identifier. This is what groups families together. So you want to make sure that field is the same for message and their attachment, and this is what's going to group families together. So on the bottom left, you see we have our control number, map to ID and our family identifier map to group ID. The way message crawler is going to work with these fields is it's going to go down the list, and once it sees a second occurrence of this group identifier, it's going to assume this is an attachment, and then it's going to go to the attachment path and it's going to look for an attachment. So you want to make sure your second occurrence of this value, or third or fourth, have attachment path, or you will get attachment not found error, which again is okay if some attachments are missing. All right, so we want to make sure we got these fields mapped. If your set does not have any attachments, you can map your family identifier to ID. Next trick I want to show you, if you want to unselect a field, you can just right click on the header and this unselects a field. Okay, so we're going to map this back. We are going to skip conversation identifier just for now. We're going to get to it in a second. Next, we have a field called message type. Message type is what determines what kind of message it is. This is something you can look up from your file format specifications. If your message type doesn't match to something that's predefined on the list, a message crawler will default to message. The other message types is when participants enter and leave groups. Next, we have our body. So body is the actual text of the message. It's always easier to have it here so you could see what it is. If this happened to be a path to a text file, which is fine too, all you have to do is select this field as a path, and message crawler will go in and pull the data from that file. Like we talked about before, you want to make sure that file does not have any headers in it. So if there is like a generated email headers, like a from and a date, the result's not going to look great. So you want to make sure this is clean text of just the message. Moving on to from. So from field is right here. This is going to be mapped to a person who sent the message. Pretty simple. Same thing, timestamp. You want to have your field that matches when the event happened, whether it's a message or a person entering the room and so on. It's a date time field. And then we have our field recipients, or to. This is a person who received the message, or it could be a field participants who else were participating in that group. This participant to or recipient to field is optional. And we can move on further. We have deleted and importance fields. So if you have those, you can map them. In this case, I do not. Well, I do not have importance. And finally, we're moving on to attachments. Our attachment path here and our attachment name, we're going to map them appropriately so that message crawler can find attachments and embed them into RSMF file. All right, the last thing we gotta do here is check our export options before we start exporting, which is going to be our messaging platform as well as type of a conversation. Type of conversation in this case is going to be direct because these people are sending messages to one another. Our export format is going to be RSMF. There are other options, and if you want to use multi-threaded export, you can do so as well. And we do need to configure our names delimiter. So if you have multiple names, which we do not have in this case because this is one-to-one communication between multiple people, I'll leave it as a semicolon, but it is important that you set your names delimiter. Different forensic software exports data with different delimiters, so we want to make sure we have it correctly set here. And if for whatever reason you ever need to export only a section of messages, you can check selected rows, so only these will get exported. However, make sure that you don't have a situation where no rows are selected, but this checkbox is selected. You can get some really weird behavior. So if you don't have any selected rows, uncheck this checkbox. This is good for testing a small portion. All right, and with that, we have everything configured that we need to generate our RSMF file. So I'm going to put a folder name where I'm going to export data to, and I'm ready to export. However, we're still missing our conversation identifier. I totally forgot about that. Okay, so the way we want to do conversation identifier is we can either specify our timestamp and specify a format mask like we talked about in the demo, but this is not the best way. Here's what I like to do, and this is what I added in the newest version, is I add a tool called format date. What we're going to do is pick our timestamp, and we're going to format it to something called short date. And this is up to you. You can pick whatever formatting you want. But short date is going to be just a date without time. And the next thing we're going to do is say apply from parent. And we'll say in a field called record type. So if record type field has value of attachment, which is this, we're going to apply our value from parent. So it's going to format timestamp to this format, and it's going to apply from parent for records that have value of attachment. All right, so it's going to be like a sort date. So let's click on that, scroll over, and now we see our generated date. And now we can use this generated date as our conversation identifier. So now we have two different dates, 12.4 and 12.5. So we should get two RSMF files if we were to select it as a generated date. Sometimes it's a good idea to resort your documents before exporting. If you have a different conversation type, you can go to sort option and sort it by conversation first and then by your ID. This will put things together a little bit better depending on the sort order of your original file. All right, and I think now we're ready to export. So I'm going to click on Generate Export, and in my export folder, I see two RSMF files. And now that we have our RSMF files exported, we're ready to go through a processing stage where we can use relativity processing to load this into relativity and see the results. But that is going to be in a separate chapter where we'll talk about processing.